about cherubim, probably the most familiar passage is not Ezekiel 28, but it's probably Ezekiel 1. When Ezekiel opens, as far as the book goes, that's where the exiles are. They're sitting by the river Kavar, they're there in Babylon, and that's where Ezekiel begins his ministry. And it launches with this vision that he has. And I actually think this is an important way to illustrate the idea that when scripture writers use this language, they're not giving us a zoology lesson, okay? This isn't about an actual creature, okay? In Ezekiel 1, the cherubim are odd and grotesque. You got the four faces, you got the wings, you got the eyes. In Ezekiel 10 has the eyes in the bodies of these creatures and whatnot. This is, I think, pretty obviously something that goes beyond a literal experience of the writer. This isn't something you'd encounter in everyday life. Now, you do encounter the imagery, because the imagery in Ezekiel 1 does come from Babylonian royal iconography, sculptures, carvings, and whatnot. But the real issue is what is it telegraphing? Now, scholars have done a lot of work on this, and I find the passage really interesting because they'll point out that if you actually look at the four faces of the cherubim, they correspond to the four cardinal points of the Babylonian zodiac. Again, the constellations. Think of the astral language that's used for heavenly creatures. They correspond to the four cardinal points. If you were somebody in Babylon, either a Babylonian or a Jew who had spent some time there, you're going to know that the meaning behind this is that the one who sits on the throne, and in Babylonian religion it would be Marduk, he's the high god there, is the one who controls the four corners, as it were, of the heavens. In other words, everything that happens in space and time, everything that happens on earth, the stars, they track time. The constellations will go through a cycle every year. So the messaging of this astronomy, really astral theology, is the course of time and the course of history. All of that is controlled by Marduk in Babylonian thought. Well, Ezekiel uses that imagery, and who does he put on the throne? It's the God of Israel, which is really a powerful message because he's writing it to people who are in exile. They're captives. And so the point of the message, and it really launches the entirety of the book, is that, yeah, we're here in Babylon, and guess what? We deserve it. But God is still on the throne. It is the God of Israel that controls the passage of time, moving from epoch to epoch in history. He is the one who is guiding all of this process, not Marduk of Babylon. So he uses really familiar imagery that conveys abstract ideas, big picture ideas. Again, it's not a zoology lesson. And he changes the one detail that's the most important: who's on the throne. And again, it's a real clear instance, again, if you know what you're looking at, of strong, powerful theological messaging. When we think about angels in the Old Testament, it's hard to miss some of the more important ones, and probably the one that comes to mind most often is the angel of the Lord. Again, it doesn't really get a proper name, just referred to as the Malach Adonai, the angel of the Lord. Now, I spent a lot of time in Unseen Realm, both the book and the film, talking about the angel of the Lord. I believe that the angel of the Lord is God himself, the second person of the Trinity, showing up as a man in the form of a human being. Now, this is an incarnation. The second person of the Trinity is going to be incarnated in Jesus of Nazareth later. So this technically isn't Jesus in the Old Testament, although it sort of is and isn't. It's the same second person of the Trinity. But if we just isolate our discussion to that figure, the angel of the Lord, it's scripturally demonstrable. Exodus 23 is an instance where God tells Moses, you better listen to this angel because my name is in him. That introduces us to something called the name theology. If you have a Jewish friend, they may refer to God himself as Hashem, the name. It's the same in the Old Testament. The name is another way of referring to God himself. Well, If we just take that little bit of knowledge, that little nugget, and go back to Exodus 23, we have God saying to Moses, I'm here, but I'm also in that angel. That angel, that supernatural being that come in the form of a man, that's me. I mean, I'm still here, but that's me as well. So this is a really important figure, and I think a lot of Bible readers sort of get that, but there are things about this figure that we kind of miss. You can make a really good case, and I do in the angel's book, that this particular angel is the destroyer in the last plague before Passover, the death of the firstborn. Because in Joshua 5, Joshua meets the captain, the commander of the Lord's armies. And there's a specific item of description there. The figure in front of Joshua has his drawn sword in his hand. If you actually search for that phrase in Hebrew, that exact phrase, it occurs only 2 other places. Both of those places, it describes the angel of the Lord. So the angel of the Lord is a militaristic figure. He is the captain of the Lord's armies. It would be not surprising to have him be the destroyer, okay, in this last plague in Egypt. And that might trouble some people. Like, we don't really think of angels as destroying and being responsible for death, and isn't this a bad thing? Isn't this what like demons do, or something like that? Because again, in modern terms, we think of anyone killing something else as an agent of evil. Well, what's going on with the last plague, I think we need to remember, is that the plagues are collectively a judgment on the gods of Egypt. God says this point blank in Exodus 12, right? This night I will have victory over the gods of Egypt. And all the plagues can be traced to some judgment on a specific Egyptian deity, and the whole Egyptian religious system, in fact. So this is a judgment against the fallen, deities. This is the Deuteronomy 32 worldview of the nations and their people. And you say, well, they're people, God should be merciful and have compassion and whatnot. It's also a reversal of what Egyptians had done to the people of Israel. Remember, what starts this all off in Exodus is the fact that Pharaoh is ordering the death of Hebrew children, specifically males. And so this is God's way of reversing that incident, God's way of pronouncing judgment. It is really sort of an example of the eye for eye, sort of thing. This final plague really strikes at the heart of where this all started. Pharaoh's lack of submission, his hostility toward the people of God. And again, it's sort of a natural kind of bookending reversal effect to what's going on. But despite all that, at the end of the day, God is the giver of life. God is God. And God can judge evil any way that he sees fit. And in some cases in the Old Testament, that does mean the death of his enemies and the enemies of his people. That does happen, and God has every right to do that, to defend his own, and in this case, he does. One of the more specific points of this reversal is Pharaoh's own firstborn child dying. Now, we have to know a little bit about Egyptian religion, and we also have to be thinking of the angel of the Lord as the second person. The Son of God is the later language that we'll encounter for the second person. The Son of God, who is God, in human form in the Old Testament as the angel of the Lord and the captain of the Lord's host and the destroyer. What's really interesting is if you look at it that way, if you frame it that way, you have the Son of God in the form of the destroyer, taking the life of the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who is, in Egyptian religion, the son of a god, the son of Horus. Pharaoh was viewed as Horus incarnate. He is Horus on earth, and he is essentially responsible for the maintenance of everything that happens on earth. In Egyptian religion, it's called Ma'at, the maintenance of cosmic order, and that is inherited. It is reincarnated with every pharaoh. So it really sets the whole death of the firstborn as it pertains to Pharaoh in a very theological light. The other two angels that people are typically familiar with, and it's really because they get names, which is unusual, are Gabriel and Michael. Now, Michael is probably the one that is kind of easiest to sort of think about because he's described as one of the chief princes. So that tells us that, hey, in the heavenly hierarchy, again, prince is going to be a status term, a hierarchy term. We have princes, and we also have chiefs of princes. So it just gives us a little indication into this hierarchical language. He is the prince of Israel. In other words, he has guardianship. He's appointed by God to have guardianship over the nation of Israel, which in turn makes sense because prince is also used in Daniel of beings over other nations, Prince of Persia, Prince of Greece, that are adversarial. This is an extension of what I refer to as the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, which is connected to what happened at Babel. The Babel judgment wasn't just about confusing languages. It was God's divorcing humanity, severing his relationship with humanity in judgment, and he assigns the nations of the world to the sons of God, to lesser members of the heavenly host. Now, eventually, those members of the heavenly host become adversarial toward God. We learn this in Psalm 82. So this idea that the other nations, the rest of humanity that gets divided up into nations, were assigned to lesser members of the heavenly host, that's actually the Old Testament's explanation for where we get eventually idolatry, where we get these other pantheons and these other gods of these other nations. It's these guys. And so that tracks into Daniel 10, and we get this hierarchical rulership language, both in terms of what's going on. They're appointed prince over these regions, but even in the heavenly sphere, Michael himself, Prince of Israel, we learn that from Daniel 10 and Daniel 12, but he's one of the chief princes. So there's another level in there somewhere. Now, Gabriel, this is actually the reason why Gabriel is considered an archangel, even though he doesn't get the same description as Michael. It's really two reasons. Later Jewish writers in the intertestamental period clearly have Gabriel as an archangel. In fact, it was kind of one of the criteria that if you get a name, you're an archangel, because all of the archangels in the literature, like of a book like First Enoch, get names. And so people are looking at Daniel 10. Gabriel is in the mix of the scene, a couple scenes in Daniel with Michael. He gets a personal name. And so, okay, he must be one of these guys as well. He must be an archangel. Again, when you get into the later literature, you get archangels actually named. They also have sort of spheres of influence or authority. So it's not that they're put over countries because the bad guys are over the other nations. Michael is Israel's prince. But the archangels in Second Temple Jewish literature are specifically tasked with, either parts of the world or different functions of the created order, something like that. So that there is this, again, hierarchical feel that the derivative, the source, and it isn't a whole lot, but the source of that turns out to be Daniel with these two named individuals. You might pick up right away on the prince language. Again, I've mentioned a couple times that a lot of the language for the hierarchical status in the heavenly host is drawn from the royal court, kingship. Again, God is king. Of course he has a council. Of course he has a court. Of course he has an entourage. Of course he has throne guardians. Of course he has sons who, again, are this higher status than others in the bureaucracy. Of course he has princes, because if you're a son of the king, you're a prince. All right? Again, the terminology just makes sense. And if you even look at the rebellions, who are the ones that rebel that wind up to be princes over the nations? Well, they're the sons of God. They're the ones who are appointed. So the terminology, there's a lot of consistency here, again, drawn from the way you would talk about a human king and his court and all of its functions and its offices, and how the heavenly bureaucracy, the heavenly host, gets talked about.